All right, I think we're going to begin class. People are probably still filtering in. Welcome, come on in. Welcome to everyone to week 5 of our Food Systems, Nutrition, and Health seminar. Before we get going with our main class for today, I have just a few announcements to share with you, starting with a reminder that indeed we are halfway through the quarter. So this is the 5th of 10 weeks of our seminar, and it's a great opportunity for a quick check-in on how your weekly assignments are going. So this is a gentle reminder for our Nutrition 400 students that you will be assessed on 5 summaries and you will have 8 opportunities. So don't feel the need to let us know if you have to miss one of those submissions. Feel free to just look forward and aim to submit 5 in total. If you have any questions, of course, you can reach out to myself or to Sam over Canvas. So yesterday began Native American History Month, and this is a really special month which involves celebrating and honoring the fundamental ways that Indigenous peoples of the land that is also known as America have stewarded and shaped these lands and waters since time immemorial. It also entails looking to the present and into the future to celebrate the first peoples who are here. We know already, as we've discussed in the seminar, that this is not the only month to celebrate and acknowledge First Nations and Native Americans. This is something that should happen all the time. And it does at the University of Washington, which is an institution that sits on the lands and waters that are the traditional territories of the Coast Salish tribes and nations. So as we've been doing for most every seminar we've had together, we pause for a moment in recognition and in acknowledgement. Now I have the opportunity to share with you a brief introduction to our speaker, and then I will turn it over. It is a real privilege to introduce our guest for today, Professor Michael Fakhri, who's the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food. Professor Fakhri is with the University of Oregon School of Law, where he teaches courses on human rights, food law, development, and commercial law. He is also the director of the Food Resiliency Project in the Environmental and Natural Resources Law Center, which I would really love to learn more about. Professor Fakhri has taught courses on the right to food at Harvard Law School, European University Institute, and the University of Arizona Indigenous Governance Program. He has delivered lectures on international human rights and development topics at universities in countries around the world, and has also led public dialogues on human rights and development with peasant organizations, labor unions, and human rights activists in the Arab region and North America, and at international organizations such as the World Trade Organization Ministerial Conference. Professor Fakhri was appointed as Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food by the Human Rights Council in March of 2020 and assumed his functions on May 1st of that year. What an extraordinary time to begin this role. Professor Fakhri, thank you so much for being here. It's truly an honor to host you, and I'm now going to turn it over to you so that we get to hear from you on what's at stake with the right to food. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you, Dr. Sipos. Really, it's such a pleasure to be here, and I do wish I was able to be here in person, considering I'm just sort of down the street here in Eugene, Oregon. What I'm going to do today is first just really introduce what is a UN Special Rapporteur. What's this position entail, and how have I sort of navigated that world. And then I'll talk about what is the right to food. What does it mean? How can you use it to think about things, to solve problems, to even frame a problem? And what are the strengths and weaknesses of a human rights approach or a right to food approach? And then I'll end really on the discussion of the Food Systems Summit. The UN Food Systems Summit was held just last month, so end of September. After about 18 months of preparation. And I was directly involved in the preparation. And as you saw in the report that was provided to you as part of the readings, I had some criticisms of that summit, and there was some shortcomings really. But really, it's not just going to be talking about the summit, but how to understand, how do we position ourselves when we are experts, when we're there with someone with very specialized knowledge? How do you navigate these spaces where you have different types of experts and different types of politics at play? And so I'll share with you the thought process and sort of how I had to position myself in light of what was going on with the UN Food Systems Summit, sort of showing you how these things actually come together, stepping away from all the sort of the I want to say, I can't think of a better word than propaganda. Inevitably, there's always propaganda behind all of these events. Okay. So first to start with, what is a UN Special Rapporteur? So the title Rapporteur is a French term for reporter. And I am one of a little over 40 special rapporteurs. What we are, we're independent experts. And we each have a very particular mandate. My mandate's the right to food, but you have the special rapporteur on racism, on the right to housing, on freedom of speech, freedom of religion, solidarity, a wide range of issues and topics. And and it's a volunteer position. So I don't get paid to do this. I have a very small team of 2 full-time people based in Geneva. But to give you a sense of where the power and authority comes from this, to give you some idea of how the UN works, the one way of starting about, so the UN, when people say the UN, it's a complex mix, and it's a large number of different institutions and agencies and a lot of people working more or less autonomously or semi-autonomously. But a good place to start to think about the UN is the General Assembly. The General Assembly is where every government of the world, more or less every government of the world, sends their representative. So the General Assembly is made up, currently it's made up of 193 governments representing nation states, national governments. And the General Assembly works based on one vote, one country, one vote. So I'm originally from Lebanon, so a small country like Lebanon has the same voting power as a large country like the United States does. So the General Assembly is that place where all the world's governments come together and they discuss things and make decisions, and they vote on their decisions, and they try and do it by consensus, but sometimes it's contentious and majority vote wins the day. From there, that's the General Assembly, right? And that's a good place to start thinking about the United Nations. That's where the political heart really of the UN is. But then there's something called the Human Rights Council. So the General Assembly is in New York. So if you were to go to New York, you have the big UN building. That's where the UN General Assembly meets, and they recently just met a few weeks ago. Now, over in Geneva, you have what's called the Human Rights Council. The Human Rights Council is also made up of governments, but a smaller number. There you have 47 governments, and each region, so they divide the world up into regions, and each region has a certain number of seats they can have, so a certain number of countries, more or less represent an entire region. So I think it's West Europe and North America are smushed together as a region. So it's not exactly geographical. I would say it's a geopolitical division of regions. And so from the 193 states at the General Assembly, that's where they vote on who they want to send to represent the regions over in Geneva at the Human Rights Council. So from 193, there's 47 states at the Human Rights Council. So the Human Rights Council is the leading human rights body of the United Nations. So when the Human Rights Council decides on something, when it comes to human rights, that is basically the highest authority on defining what human rights means, on authorizing human rights investigations, on making statements, on condemning certain actions, on supporting certain actions. So that's the body that gives me my mandate. So the Human Rights Council decides how many special rapporteurs they want. So like I said, there's over 40. They decide what are the terms of the mandate of, in my case, the right to food. And then the way you become a special rapporteur is you apply. So I just filled out a form online and then did an interview. And the idea is, so that's sort of the authority and the power in the institutional structure behind it. So what is a special rapporteur? My job is to be the eyes and ears for the UN. My job is to go and, like the name suggests, to report, to investigate, to report, to listen to people, to bear witness, to understand what's going on in the world when it comes to things addressing hunger, famine, and malnutrition. And I frame how I investigate in terms of human rights, and I propose solutions of what governments should do, what companies should do, what people should do. So my job is to be the eyes and ears. It's really, another way to think about it is to be the center of gravity, be the centerpiece of conversation and debate and information gathering around issues regarding hunger, famine, and malnutrition from this human rights perspective. So in terms of just my formal basic obligations, I write 2 reports a year, what are called thematic reports. I present one to the Human Rights Council, one to the General Assembly. So I just presented the report you all read. I presented it to the General Assembly about a week or 2 ago. So I stand in front of the General Assembly, in front of the world's governments, and explain what I saw with the Food System Summit. But more importantly, what I focused on is COVID and COVID-19, and my frustration with the fact that the world's governments are not working together. They're not collaborating. They're not working in solidarity. They're not helping each other out to tackle the food crisis, excuse me, that has been triggered by COVID. So part of my job was sort of to wag my finger at world governments and say, why aren't you doing what you're supposed to be doing? And here's how you should do it. And here's how I can help. And here's what I see. Here's what I've heard. And here's what I understand, and to share it with them. So I do these 2 reports a year. And then I do country visits. I get to visit 2 different countries a year, theoretically. I haven't traveled because of COVID, so I haven't had a chance to do a country visit. But I visit a country, I send out requests, I want to visit this country or that country, and the governments accept the invitation or they ignore my invitation, and then we sort of track that down. And then if they accept my invitation, the government has to open up all their doors to me. So I get to talk to all government officials, investigate, interview at the highest levels, but also meeting worker groups, peasant groups, fisher groups, advocacy groups, feminist organizations, meeting as many people as possible. And then I put together a country report identifying what is a country doing well and what can it do to really fulfill and meet their right to food obligations. So that's what a special rapporteur is. So in the most basic term, my job is to be the leading expert on the right to food for the UN, serving the UN system broadly defined. But also, I would add, my job is to also highlight what's going on in the world, but also share publicly. So my job, I also see, is to learn in public. So to learn what I'm learning with people as broadly as possible, because what I'm learning is how the UN works, how governments work, how power operates on a global scale. And so I think part of my job is to be a good public teacher as I'm learning. So as I'm doing my job, I'm learning how things work, and I want to share that with as many people as possible. The key point, the key source of my power is not just that the Human Rights Council has given me the authority, so the world's government's sort of deeming me the special rapporteur, but my independence. And that's the thing that I always am very careful to protect. And this theme will come up time and time again. So I'm independent. I am independent of governments. I'm independent of the UN. I decide what I write about in terms of thematic reports. I decide what countries I think I want to try and visit. I make a lot of decisions, and I try, and many rapporteurs, the way you do that is you hold yourself almost accountable, so to speak, to people, to governments, so you try and work and collaborate as broadly as possible. But in the end, I make the choices, and then people either think it's a good idea or it's a bad idea. But that independence allows me to be a critical voice when it comes to dealing with people in power, whether they're in power in government, whether they're in power in the United Nations, whether they're in power in leaders of corporations, my independent and my judgment. So there's an element of I judge what people are doing. That distance I have, that independent distance I have, is what gives me my power. But at the same time, I try to hold myself accountable to social movements. And what I mean by social movements are peasant groups, so or trade unions, or groups of people who are representing their own interests. Not, and it's one way to contrast that is to, for example, an organization that is advocating on behalf of someone else. These are groups where people are saying, we are all local farmers, we're forming our own organization, or we are all workers and we are all joining a union and we are representing our own interests. So I try and meet as much as possible and hold myself accountable as much as possible directly to social movements. So that's sort of how I do the job. So that's what is a special rapporteur. So special rapporteur is an independent expert commissioned by the UN, in my case, to focus on the right to food, which involves questions of hunger, famine, and malnutrition. And the job is to report, to investigate, to bear witness, but to also to educate and to provide advice. So that's what a UN special rapporteur is. Now, more specifically, what is the right to food? So if this was a law class, we would start with an international treaty. So the world governments came together in the 1960s, and they came and they signed and ratified a treaty and said, okay, we're going to create a treaty that explains what certain rights are. And this treaty is called the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And it has a lot of different rights included there. One of the rights there is the right to food. So that's the place to start. But the like all rights, even if we're talking the Bill of Rights in the United States, any concept of rights is always changing. It's dynamic, it's evolving. So the meaning of the right to food continues to change and evolve as people use it and define it and redefine it. So I look, when I started this job, I looked at how's the right to food being defined by different authoritative agencies and organizations and social movements. And I try to define it and articulate it in a way that makes sense to me, but makes sense to the world we're in today. And as Dr. Sipos pointed out, I started this in the middle of a pandemic. So I've never been a special rapporteur. I've never been in a pandemic like this. So I have no experience to draw from. And I had to sort of come up with a working definition of the right to food that continues to evolve as I continue this job. Let me just start broadly with how I understand human rights in general. So human rights, I understand human rights as a way of understanding relationships in our everyday life. And I think human rights focuses our attention on the relationship between governments and people. That's really what human rights is about fostering that relationship between governments and people. And I believe that relationship is going to be key to getting us through this pandemic, to navigate the complexities of any food system. And in the end, a government is only as strong as its people. And that's one relationship. I think the second relationship that's important is people's relationship to the environment. People are only as strong as the biosphere. And so the purpose in my mind of human rights is to ensure that every sector of the economy, every aspect of society serves and empowers those relationships, the government and the people and the environment. And so the key to human rights and so the right to food specifically is that people should be at the center of it all, not profits, not geopolitics. So even the idea of markets should serve people. And for too long, society has been designed, I would say for the last 50 years, has been designed to serve markets. And so the right to food, what it sort of articulates is that people must have as much control as possible over their own food system, over their own destiny in the end. And in turn, governments are obliged to create the conditions for all people to be able to access good, nutritious, affordable food with dignity now and into the future. So let me get just quickly into the specifics of the right to food, and then I'll turn over to the food system. So if you were to read the International Covenant on Economic and Social Rights from back in the day, it really framed the right to food in a narrow way, that the right to food is the right to be free from hunger. And I think the right to food is a lot more than that. I think the right to food is the right for everyone to celebrate life through their meals with each other in communion. And I think what that highlights is that food is a central feature of our daily life, of our daily pleasure, of the way we create community, the way we create society, the way we build our sense of who our people are, our nations. It's such a key feature. And I don't want people to lose sight that a key feature of food is, of course, the pleasure of it, the pleasure of people's company, the pleasure of cooking, and of course, the pleasure of eating. And I think that's a powerful notion, and it's a cultural idea, and we can't discount that. So food is a key way that people define their understanding of who they are in their relationship with their community. Food is also a central way of how people establish their relationship with the land and with waterways. So with this in mind, you see how food is a core aspect of building communities and societies and governments and all of that. Now, in more specific terms, the right to food means that everyone is entitled for their food to always be adequate, available, and accessible. Okay, and I'll go through those three things. What does that mean, right? Adequate, available, and accessible. So on that first point, the right to food means that food must be adequate. The way I think about adequate food, is that people must have good food, and they have the right to determine what is good food. Who gets to decide what is good food? Is it the nutritionist? Is it the government expert? Is it the doctor? Is it their mother? Is it their community? That's what this raises, that question of who gets to decide. And the idea is people, and that's a hard, what do we even mean by people? Is it your local? Is it the local base or national or international? But it just frames the question in that particular way. People must decide for themselves what is culturally, nutritionally, socially, ecologically appropriate food based on their particular condition. So people must have good food. That's what I mean by adequate. And there's a key value here, and I think the key value here is dignity. How people eat and how people choose to eat reflects their sense of power over who they are, their relationship with their past, their relationship with their community. So food must be adequate, food must be good food. Second, food must be available. It has to be around. So it has to be good food and it has to be around. So people must have a reliable source of food. Now you can do this in a couple different ways. It could be either by directly feeding oneself, by working the land, or access to natural resources, things like water and good soil and that sort of thing. Or it's about having access to food that's in the shops and in the markets. You should be able to buy a good food, and it should be affordable. So you should have a decent enough income to be able to buy good food. Food must be affordable so that you can afford, so you can buy it. The key value here, when we're saying food must be available, is the key value here is fairness. So that means that people's access to resources must be equitable, and markets should be fair markets, meaning the price should be fair, it should be stable. People should be able to make a living by being a food producer or by being a food worker. So food must be adequate, food must be available, and food finally must be accessible. So governments must ensure that everyone has access to food. So you can have a lot of food available, but if it's too expensive, no one can access it, or no one has a good enough income, they can't buy any food, or there's no land, no one can grow their own food. So not only must it be available, people must be able to access that food. And you can access food in a bunch of different ways. One, it could be economically. You should be able to buy food. You should be able to afford food. This means that institutions must ensure that people should be able to get a good meal. So like I said, you could do it through the buying of food, right? But it could also be through school meals. So in grade school, this could be providing free school meals to children. This could, in a university setting, this could be about making sure that the food on campus is affordable, it's good food, and that students are eating in a way that, again, that is affordable. I don't know if any universities have ever offered free meals to students. I wonder what that would look like, sort of a right to food program. I know more and more schools, more and more universities do have food banks on campus. Here at the University of Oregon, we have a food bank. And food banks are not, I think, a solution in and of itself, but it's a way of providing some access to students, because many students don't have access to good food, based on income, based on many reasons. So it's something I imagine you might be discussing or have already discussed in terms of how accessible is food on campus, on your own campus. So that's the economically accessible. You should be able to get it through some sort of institution somehow. You should be able to have the time and resources to cook your own food and feed your family and feed your community. Food must also be physically accessible. So that means that all food systems and institutions should be universally inclusive. Again, the key value here is inclusivity. So the way when I think about accessibility, I think of a kitchen. Very specifically, I think of a kitchen, and think of a kitchen broadly defined. Kitchen being anywhere where we finally, that final point of processing food right before we eat it. Cooking isn't just, of course, eating food. We eat food raw in many ways, but so that preparing and processing food. So if you think about accessibility of having access to a kitchen, having access to that point where food, that final preparation point for food, is a good way of thinking of accessibility. So regardless of a person's physical ability, the state of their health, their legal status, their housing situation, governments must support everyone's ability to get to a kitchen in order to obtain or make a good meal, right? So that's the real specific thing, definition of the right to food. The point here is that when you think of food in terms of a human right, it's an entitlement. Everyone is entitled to this. You can demand this from any level of government. You don't have to wait for the government to provide it. You don't have to wait for the government to pass a law. It is your inherent right to say, my food must be good food. I should have control over a say in my food system. It should be accessible. It should be available. It should be adequate. It's not a charity model. The charity model meaning that based on the benevolence of people with power and plenty, people with money, they give charity, and those of us without money sort of have to wait for people to give us charity. Charity often historically and today's society is often used as a way to control people living in poverty. Often what comes with a lot of poverty relief programs is a lot of conditions. Well, we'll help you, but you have to meet very specific eligibility criteria. We'll help you, but you have to do something first for us to help you. Whereas human rights approach says, everyone, no matter who you are, what's your situation, what choices you've made, you're entitled in this specific way. So that's the right to food. That's sort of the specifics of the right to food. And just to sum up, the right to food is about good relations between the government and the people based on accountability and dignity. It's about a good relationship between people and the land and waterways. And the idea is that good food makes people stronger and the land more resilient. So it's about relationships, and it's this give and take. And a good food system based on human rights, based on accountability, based on dignity, based on access, it should be sort of everyone taking care of each other, everyone making each other stronger, feeding each other, eating well. So you can imagine, and that happens, that does happen in certain instances. Okay, so that's what the right to food is. So let me turn to what was the UN Food Systems Summit, and then I'll talk about what was the controversy and how I navigated that world. So about a little over 2 years ago, the UN Secretary General, I'll explain what's the UN Secretary General do. The UN Secretary General, his name is Antonio Guterres. He's a former head of state for Portugal. So the Secretary General announced we should have a global food systems summit because hunger is on the rise and governments aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing. They need to be sort of inspired to change, to transform their food systems to make the world's food systems better, because it doesn't seem like the food systems are doing their job, which is, if hunger is on the rise and malnutrition is on the rise and obesity is on the rise, that means something's not right. So he said, let's do something about it. So already you get a sense of, so the Secretary General is elected by the General Assembly. The world government picks one person to sort of be the head civil servant, the leading bureaucrat of the United Nations system, broadly speaking. And so this different Secretary Generals have done this job differently. And so you start to see one power that the Secretary General has is to focus government and the world's attention on a particular problem. So to set the political agenda, that's one thing a Secretary General does. And to convene, the power of bringing people together and say, let's all get together and figure this out together, right? So he used his power of drawing attention to a problem, broken food system, and to convene. He said, well, I'm going to bring together not just governments, but a wide range of this language of stakeholders to come together in September 2021. It was supposed to be in New York, but it was all virtual, to come together and develop ideas, tools, something, to do something about these broken food systems. And then, okay, everyone's like, oh, that's an interesting idea. It's a bit general and vague. Well, why not? Let's see. And he designates a special envoy. So he says, okay, on my behalf, here's my idea. Well, it's not his idea. Someone pitches it to him. He's like, oh, that's great. He takes this idea, puts it forward, says, let's do this. Let's devote some resources and time and effort. And he picks someone to be his special envoy, to act on his behalf, to actually organize this food system summit. And this is when the controversy begins. So the Secretary General of the United Nations, the leading public official of the United Nations, picks Dr. Agnes Kalibata, who is a scientist. She's the former Minister of Agriculture of Rwanda, and she's the president of an organization called the African Green Revolution Alliance, AGRA, A-G-R-A. This organization and Dr. Kalibata are very aligned and very close with corporations. They believe that the solution to any food systems needs to come from some close relationship with corporations. The reason this was controversial is that many, if not most people, committed to human rights, committed to the right to food, part of the right to food community, believe that corporations have been the root cause of the problem. And the problem being the concentration of power. The problem being that corporations are designed to create profit. That's what they're designed to do, is to generate profit. And it's hard to hold a corporation liable. It's hard to hold a corporation accountable. So when corporations make a mess, as they have done in our food systems, by encouraging the use of pesticides, by encouraging industrial practices that create food systems that mimic almost a factory rather than ecological processes, by exploiting workers, by ignoring animal welfare concerns. This sort of mentality of prioritizing profit has created the problems we're in today of polluting our waters, et cetera, et cetera. And so the human rights argument is we shouldn't let the people that cause the problem be part of the solution. We should hold them accountable. Governments have also been part of the problem, but at least governments, we have this relationship with them because they're governments after all. Even if they fall short, theoretically, they are accountable to the people. They're not driven by a profit motivation, and they shouldn't be. Whereas corporations are the core, are the root cause of the problem. And the problem being, again, they concentrate power, and all of a sudden it's a small group of people who run these corporations that are making these choices. And when you have a small group of people with a lot of power and they're not held accountable, that always leads to problems. That always leads to also violence, and that leads to any good idea that's run through a power matrix where the few govern the many, it's inevitably going to be a disaster, And so just from the beginning, when the Secretary General picked as a special envoy someone who really has a close relationship with industry and corporations, the human rights community immediately said, this is not right. And from the beginning, so I was later then invited to be part of a committee that met regularly, all the leadership. So the summit, the idea is let's bring the world together, all the corporations and all civil society and all the social movements and all the governments, and they're gonna come up with the best ideas of how to transform food systems. So I was invited to be in part of that leadership role. And my job was to try and push and put human rights on the agenda. So I spent the first year, me and many others involved, trying to convince and explain why human rights needs to be on the agenda. And it was a weird argument to make because I kept saying, the Secretary General supports human rights. Why are we having this argument? Why wouldn't it be better to actually say, yes, of course, human rights is on the agenda, and let's debate and articulate and define what does human rights mean right here, right now, in the midst of a pandemic. So that was my job, is to sort of to push and push and push. Meanwhile, over 500 organizations were really getting frustrated. They were saying, we don't want to be involved in a summit where we have to advocate for human rights to be on the agenda. Human rights should be on the agenda from the beginning. We're boycotting because this sounds like it's stacked against us. We only have so much time and so much energy. We're dealing with a pandemic. Why should we join a summit in which human rights is something we have to fight for rather than to fight for defining it and implementing it? We're fighting whether it should even be on the agenda in the first place. Other groups said, we're reluctant to boycott because if we're not directly involved, this summit's going to run amok. They stayed involved. So my job was to listen to everyone committed to human rights, whether they were boycotting or not, and to take all of this, all the people committed to human rights within the summit, all the people committed to the summit that are protesting against it, that are boycotting it, that are creating counter mobilizations, understand what they're saying, hear what they're saying, find the commonalities, and then bring and deliver that message to the highest levels of leadership, to Dr. Kalibata, to the Secretary General's office, to everyone who's in a leadership position in the summit, and say, listen, this is what people are saying. This is how they are articulating their own definition of human rights. And it doesn't get more powerful than hundreds of organizations representing millions of people saying, this is what human rights means to us. This is what we demand. And what they demanded is space for groups to organize themselves, an autonomous space for civil society, where people can organize on their own terms and come up with their own final document based on solidarity amongst these different groups. They wanted that. And previous UN food system summits had done that before. So they weren't asking for anything new in that regard. And they were asking for a particular track to say, we need to hold corporations accountable. They caused the problem. Why don't we talk about corporate accountability as a core element? They asked for that. And amongst several other sort of right to food themes. Most of their demands were ignored. I would say 90% of their demands were ignored. And so here I was in a position where I was now worried. I was worried that my presence, just the fact that I was involved in this summit, was going to be used in a way to avoid dealing with people's demands. And this is what I mean by that. There's a way of doing human rights that uses the language of human rights, but it's just a lot of words that really mask the lack of action. We see this in the climate change summit going on right now. We see this with politicians all the time. They say things that sound right. Well, they're saying we need to transform our food systems to be more sustainable. They're saying that they respect indigenous perspectives. They're saying that they really value human rights. So where's the controversy? And this is the slippery part. This is where one has to be very careful on how language is being used, misused. Is it used to clarify things? Is it used to muddle things? So this is what was happening with the summit. In the beginning, they didn't want human rights on the agenda. So we were fighting. We want human rights. So we got human rights on the agenda. Now the summit leadership was saying, okay, of course we respect human rights, but they weren't explaining what it meant, and they were treating it like this choice, and they would sort of, if there's a human rights panel, it would be at an awful hour on the sidelines. It wouldn't be at the core of all the discussions and all the debates. So first, human rights is excluded, then it's brought in, but really in the margins of discussions and debates and agendas and the programming. And it's treated as a choice. But if you remember when I was describing what is the right to food, it is an obligation. Governments are obliged to fulfill people's right to food. People are entitled to demand their right to food. This is not a choice, but the summit used it as a way to appear, the summit leadership used it as a way to appear like they're doing something, a way to appear like they're doing something progressive. But in reality, when you start looking a lot more closely and parsing through all the press releases, but looking at how the things actually, the choices they were making, what were they leaving out? Who were they leaving out? Who were they giving leadership positions? Who are they not giving leadership positions? What I started to see, and many others started to see, is that they're not committed to human rights in any substantive way. This is a way for the corporate sector to try and change what they do, make it more green, more sustainable, to change the type of food they might deliver, maybe more plant-based food, maybe use regenerative agriculture, whatever, but without changing the power structure. And here's where I'm going to conclude. I think whenever you're operating, and you all are going to graduate, or hopefully you'll graduate, and you'll go and you'll have a career and you'll have a job, and at some point someone's going to ask you for your professional and for your expert opinion. And you'll have some good ideas. Of course you will. I'll have some good ideas, and I give people my ideas. But it's always important you have to have a particular theory of change and a particular theory of power. The Food Systems Summit theory of change and power went like this: that if you just brought the organizations and the companies that already had power, and you just gave them a bunch of good ideas, if the people who already have power implement these clever ideas, the world will be a better place. If Coca-Cola and Nestle and Cargill and the meat processing plants and all of these agri-food companies, they just had better ideas, then the world will be more green, more sustainable, a better place, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a theory of power that says, work within the status quo and come up with clever ideas and try and convince the people with power that you are the expert with a clever idea. And then we will deliver this good idea to the farmers, to the pastoralists, to the fishers, to the workers, to the poor people of the world, and we'll tell them, we have come up with a clever idea. This is what we're going to do. I think a human rights approach that is from the ground up, a human rights approach that starts with the power that people have in their own hands already, that's a different theory of change and power. There, the idea is, it doesn't matter, it almost doesn't matter what your good idea is. It's who's coming up with the idea. Start with the ideas that people are developing for themselves. People know how to change their own food system. People know what they need to solve their own problems. The challenge becomes, how do you organize people's power? It's a theory of power that is based on organizing the power that people already have. And so a theory of change is about redistributing power and reorganizing power. So it's about challenging those who have power, using the challenge. Can human rights be one tool? It's a tool amongst several other types of tools to help people organize themselves, organize their power, to challenge the small number of people that have created the problems and undo the power structure. So my position really is, unless you have a theory of power, you're just going to reproduce the problems and maybe make it a little more green, but you're really not solving the root cause. And I'll end with this. The biggest mystery and bizarre thing to me is the Food Systems Summit did not address COVID-19, did not address the pandemic, did not address the food crisis we're in today. So it wasn't designed to solve the problems of people today. It was designed to solve the problems of some fantasy world where there's no COVID. So it was a weird summit. What it did do is it focused government attention. All the governments of the world now realize that they have to transform their food systems now. The summit is saying, come hang out with our experts and our corporations, and they'll solve your problem, national governments. Whereas the human rights community is saying, no, governments, you have to listen to the people and work with the people, and that's how we're going to transform things. So I'll end there. Thank you very much. Hopefully we'll have a few moments to have a conversation or a discussion, and we'll take it from there.
Michael, thank you so very much. That was such a far-ranging and really detailed look at both human rights, right to food, and also just some of the unpacking of the summit. And so that was just an amazing presentation to hear, and I wish you were in the room with us. I wish we were all together so there could be a room full of students clapping in appreciation. So Sam, I just want to turn it over to you to see if there are any questions from the audience to get us going in the last 5 minutes here.
Are there any questions? Oh, we have a question.
Okay, so I want to ask, like, you are optimistic with like solving the food system problem, or like to challenge these small number of people. Like, are you optimistic with it?
So the question was, are you optimistic about the solutions for the future of food systems?
You know, that's the question of optimism is always there. You know, I think I would reframe it. You know, some days I'm optimistic, other days I'm pessimistic, some days I'm cynical, other days I'm hopeful. I would put it more in terms of there's no choice. There's no choice but to fight. There is no choice but to struggle. It's not like, well, should we transform our food system or not? Should I try and feed my family or not? Should I eat today in a healthy way that is sustaining my community today and future generations? There is no choice. So what does one do? So for me, what do I do when I'm feeling pessimistic or cynical? That's a harder sort of, how do I overcome that and become sort of, we take turns. Some days I'm the one yelling and leading and writing the report and performing and doing the heavy lifting. And I have to rely on the support of others. You know, that means that I'm able to do this job because my spouse is able to sort of cover childcare. My parents can chip in. And so can I do it today? It's a communal effort in the end. Other days, I can't be in the front. I'm more in the background. I'm taking care of the person out in the front, doing the hard work, doing the fighting, the yelling, the compromising, the negotiating. So for me, I think of it more as division of labor, and the challenge is to not burn out. And it's manage one's energy, one's political energy, one's physical energy, one's sense. So once I'm starting to feel like I'm feeling cynical or pessimistic, I'm like, that's probably because I'm tired. And that means I got to take care of myself. I got to ask for help. And I got to hang back and maybe let someone else jump in the front. And my job is to cook that night, to cook the meal and to feed people and take care. So I really frame things of taking care of each other, right? There's no choice. We always take care of each other. It's just more of what's my strength, what's my weakness, where am I at? Because I think it's honest to feel hopeless. It's honest to feel angry. It's honest to feel cynical, and to just sit in that space and not to say, well, we must be hopeful. No, we can say that's a brick wall. What do we do now? How do we figure this out together? Who do I need to talk to? What new relationships do I need to develop? What new friends do I need, or new people to work with? That's usually how I think through these things. And I am hopeful because the social movements have been incredibly strong. They mobilized against the Secretary General within the UN structure. And the Secretary General was forced to respond to our demands, to my demand, to say, why is it human rights on the agenda? So I think in terms of the struggle against the Food System Summit as a design, it was a victory because we showed another way is not only possible, it's feasible. I think people did show that on their own terms from the grassroots.
Thank you so much, Michael. I know there are going to be other questions. I have other questions, but we are at time. So I want to invite all the students in the room and who are watching the recording to please share your questions through your weekly summaries, and we will pass them on to Michael so he can know what else is on your mind. I think you've given us just a tremendous amount to work with so that we can follow some of these social movements, some of these ongoing interactions that are really looking at tracking and creating the future that we want. And as you're saying, all the students who are watching your presentation are going to be part of creating that future. And so this role of human rights and the centrality of the right to food has, I think, just given us a lot to think about and work with, and we will have a lot of opportunity to keep digging into these concepts over the seminar. Michael, I want to thank you again. The time went too quickly. Thank you so much, everyone. I know we'll have a lot to say, and we will follow up with you afterwards. Thank you so much for your time. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. It was a pleasure, and I look forward to getting your questions or comments, and maybe at some point we'll meet in the future. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Yona and Samantha.